Rhino 6 and 7, Grasshopper is included, and 8 as well. Algorithmic modeling tool. What do we mean by algorithmic modeling tool? So typically when we're working in Rhino, we're doing a lot of clicking. We're using tools and we're going click, click, click to make things like a cylinder. So in this example, when we want to make a cylinder, we click once to place the center of it. We make a second click to drag out kind of the radius of that cylinder, and then a third click for the height of it. And what we end up with at the end of that process is one fixed cylinder shape. We can manipulate it from there, but it's pretty much just kind of this like one fixed piece of geometry. In Grasshopper, it's a very different way of working. So Grasshopper is what's called like a node-based workflow. If you've ever used other softwares, maybe more complicated ones like Touch Designer or things like Blender, you might be familiar with a node-based workflow. So instead of making a bunch of clicks, we have what are called components that we play around with and layer in sequence to allow us to plug in different values, change different inputs, and build a cylinder. Instead of by click, click, clicking, now we have essentially kind of like the recipe for making a cylinder. So we can specify the location of that cylinder, the radius of it, and the height or the length of it using numeric inputs instead of clicks. And we can end up with the same result. So similar recipe, different strategy, same output. But the beauty of Grasshopper, we've kind of set up this recipe for cooking a cylinder. Now we can change the inputs and get a whole bunch of different outputs from the same recipe. So instead of just making one fixed cylinder, now we have the ability to make an entire array of cylinders with those same kind of strategies or recipes by changing the inputs. This is what's called an associative design method. Other people call it parametric design. You might also hear the term computational design, algorithmic design. Basically, it's just like designing a little algorithm, a little computational process for doing something instead of click, click, clicking, doing it manually. So again, it's kind of similar to baking cookies. If you have chocolate chip cookies that you're setting out to make, Grasshopper is kind of like making a recipe for those cookies. You can change the inputs, you can change the amounts of different things like sugar, butter, eggs, all that good stuff. And if you change the inputs, change those various amounts or parameters, you'll get an entirely different chocolate chip cookie. You've set up the recipe, you can change those inputs or chocolate chip cookies or sugar and get very different outputs really quickly. So this is what it can start to look like if you get into the weeds a little bit in Grasshopper. It can build up really quickly into very complex things, very complex operations. You can do really intense, very cool stuff inside of Grasshopper if you stick with it and understand kind of the basic processes. And it kind of builds on this idea of like parametric iteration. So in ye olden days, architecture was largely made up of a bunch of old white men kind of lying on their stomachs drawing buildings. And when they would decide to iterate on a design, they would have to lie on their stomach and iterate again from scratch. There was no way to kind of like carry stuff forward or crank out iterations really quickly. It was kind of have an idea, test it, doesn't work. Okay, back to the drawing board. Have an idea, test it, doesn't work. Okay, back to the drawing board. In a parametric way of working or iterating, you can design that recipe, crank out a bunch of iterations with those certain parameters, and then choose from the ones that you've created. So instead of having to start from scratch, you can make changes and work really quickly in a way that is more loose than when you're kind of drawing fixed lines or fixed geometries. What can you use Grasshopper for? If you Google Grasshopper or parametric design, a lot of the stuff that's going to come up is going to have a certain look and feel to it. There's kind of like a computational design aesthetic that's emerged in the past 10, 15 years. This is largely a function of the first use for Grasshopper, which is kind of form finding and design. So Grasshopper and computational design lets us create geometries that would be super hard to create if we were doing it manually. If we were kind of clicking to make this geometry, it would be super hard. So a lot of the things that you'll see when you kind of first start looking into parametric design, they're kind of a product of being able to do. Just because we can do it doesn't mean we should necessarily, but These tools allow you to work with math, work with numbers, work with kind of form finding and geometric explorations to create more organic or interesting kind of mathematical shapes. So form finding and design is something you're going to see a lot inside of Grasshopper. So for example, this is a recipe up at the top here for making this kind of cool, almost like diagrid. Maybe this is a column, maybe this is a tower. And with this recipe, you can create kind of all of these different outputs very quickly by changing the inputs. Another thing that Grasshopper is really great for, and we're seeing more and more in professional practice, is analysis and simulation. So Grasshopper is kind of like a computer inside of Rhino. Some people have even hooked up AIs inside of Grasshopper and had AI doing Rhino stuff. But it's basically just like a way of working computationally. And so it's great for certain kind of analyses like structural optimization, studying the environment, so things like daylight studies, wind analysis, all that good stuff. You'll touch on this more maybe in some of your other courses or option courses, especially in your master's program if you choose to pursue it. But there's some really amazing capabilities of using a computer inside of 3D modeling software like this. There's also kind of basic physics simulations that we can run through. So things like tensile structures are achievable in something like Grasshopper using additional plugins. So tensile structures, inflatables, all that good stuff. We can simulate gravity inside of Rhino in an interesting way. It's also great for fabrication. So doing really complicated assemblies of material is something that can be made much easier in software like Grasshopper that's kind of approaching it more rigorously or computationally. And my favorite function of Grasshopper is how it can just speed up some of your workflows. So if you get kind of proficient with Grasshopper and you're able to move more quickly, it's really great for doing repetitive tasks really quickly. So I always see every year a lot of landscape students like drawing a bunch of rocks. Like maybe they're cutting a section through the ground and they're like, I want to draw every rock that's being cut through, which is a really beautiful sentiment. But then you watch them draw rocks for like 6 hours and it's just really painful. So Grasshopper is good for things like that. Any kind of repetitive tasks that you might be doing over and over and over again. It can help you kind of save time and cut down on some of those efforts by using algorithms or structures to do it more quickly and effectively. Not that drawing rocks isn't a bad exercise. It actually sounds really nice. It's also good for mapping and diagramming. So we'll spend some time in the latter half of the course showing you how you can build topography, site models, context models, all that good stuff, and make some good maps and analysis diagrams using Grasshopper. So we'll touch a lot on some kind of geographic information system stuff after reading week. So we'll really use Grasshopper to its fullest potential. That's my favorite use of Grasshopper. Outside of that, that's pretty much kind of what Grasshopper can do. It might be a little bit overwhelming at first, but we're gonna start from the very basics. We're gonna start with trying to cook a cylinder inside of Grasshopper. For today, we're gonna be using one kind of quick reference file that's up on Canvas if you want to follow along. Not necessary, there's no checkpoint today. But if you check under Files and then Intro to Grasshopper, there should be a, oh, maybe it's not there. Never mind. Okay, so maybe I'll quickly upload an Intro to Grasshopper file, Grasshopper Basics. And so this one hopefully should have just some kind of like tips and tricks for navigating around and inside of Grasshopper. This is from my last class. This is something we could do inside of Grasshopper. We can make really complicated topographies inside of Rhino working with spatial data. I'm going to start a new file and show you how to access Grasshopper. So inside of Rhino, Grasshopper is a plugin for Rhino. I'm running Rhino 8, but it should be in the same spot if you're on 7 or 6 or even 5. So you can get to Grasshopper by coming up to the standard menu up at the top and clicking this weird little green circle with a little grasshopper on it. If you zoom into it, the logo is really cute. It's like a little grasshopper saying hello. It's very cute. So you can just click that big green circle, or you can also type into the command line Grasshopper. And what you should get when you open up Grasshopper is a new floating window. This is separate from your Rhino window, so you can move your Rhino window around. It's separate from your Grasshopper window. I definitely recommend using 2 monitors if you're working with Grasshopper, because you can have your Rhino screen up on one monitor and your Grasshopper window up on a second. When you're opening Grasshopper for the first time, you'll probably get a little pop-up that I haven't gotten, just offering some kind of basic tutorial files. So those are actually really great. If you have time to go through those tutorials, I highly recommend it if you're interested in Grasshopper. But otherwise, we're just gonna kind of ignore those for now. You can see these big, scary red and green blocks. These are just kind of previous files that I'd worked with. So I can show you. Maybe I won't click on them because they're really heavy, but just kind of big computational files working with spatial data are ones that I use really frequently. If you've never opened Grasshopper before, I don't think anything will show up here for you. But what you should have is kind of this basic, maybe I'll just drag something in so it goes away. You should have a big empty canvas. So this big kind of tan expanse, this is what's called the canvas. And you can navigate around it just like you do inside of Rhino. It's a 2D space, so it's just like a flat surface. There's nothing 3D going on in this Grasshopper window. You can navigate around it the same way that you do in Rhino space. So I'm on a trackpad right now and I can just kind of zoom around it on my trackpad, but you should be able to right click and pan. Scroll to zoom in or zoom out. And then we can click and drag these little buttons up at the top onto the canvas. And that's how we start adding what's called nodes or components. So there's a whole bunch of tabs up at the top here in Grasshopper. I have quite a few more than you will probably. These are just extra plugins that are that I've installed separately into Grasshopper. So don't worry if you don't see these. Yours is probably going to stop at display. So you should have a params or parameters tab, a maths tab, which we're gonna try to ignore as much as possible because math is scary. Sets, this is also kind of similar to maths, so we're gonna try to skip over these 2 for the most part. Vector, which is gonna talk about kind of direction and movement, really useful if we wanna move stuff around in Grasshopper. Curve, which is great for playing and analyzing with curve geometry. Surfaces, again, ditto, but just with surfaces. Mesh, which again, we're gonna try to ignore for the most part. Intersect, so calculating where things touch each other. And transform, so just basic stuff under transform, like moving things, rotating things, all that good stuff. I recommend you take a look through these tabs at some point and just kind of check out the names of stuff. The biggest issue in Grasshopper is just trying to understand what exists and what you can do. So the more that you kind of understand or see names for things, the more fluent you'll start to become in the software. So we've got our big empty canvas. It's got kind of a corner to it. I think the corner is just like a psychological endpoint to kind of anchor yourself inside of Grasshopper space, because you can get a little bit lost if you start zooming around. If you get super lost in space, you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, there should be a little like compass thing. And that's pointing in the direction of the origin point or the corner of that canvas. So if you ever get lost, that little arrow in the corner will point you back in the direction of the corner there. Other things in Grasshopper, it should look identical if you're on a PC versus a Mac. The only slight difference is that a PC will have File, Edit, View, Display tabs up at the top of this window here, whereas a Mac will have those kind of drop-down menus up at the top where our Rhino menus might be. So that's the only slight difference. So I'm gonna start to play around with that Grasshopper basics file that we have up on Canvas. So you can hit download on that one. You can see what it downloads at the end of the day as a .gh file. So a .gh file is a Grasshopper binary file. And if I move that, maybe I'll move that one to my desktop so we can see a little bit more clearly. Grasshopper basics. This is what a GH binary file little icon will look like. It'll probably give you that little blue logo. And I highly recommend opening up Rhino and Grasshopper before you start playing with any saved files. If you just double click on a Grasshopper file, it'll try to open Rhino, but it might get confused. So I highly recommend getting Rhino up and running, opening up Grasshopper, and then working from there. So in this case, I can grab my Grasshopper basics file and click and drag it onto my Grasshopper canvas. So I can click and drag it straight into Grasshopper, and it'll open that file nicely for me. And what we should have in this file is just a little map of a couple things that we want to get comfortable with in Grasshopper. So we'll work through all of these little groups. If you have any trouble dragging and dropping a Grasshopper file onto the canvas, you can also come up to File and then Open Document and navigate to your little GH file. Okay, so starting in the upper left-hand corner, welcome to Grasshopper. I've just got some little tips and notes in these floating yellow sticky notes or panels. So these are just some kind of quick notes of things you might want to pay attention to. This first one here is talking about the way that components are drawn in Grasshopper. So if I grab a component up at the top here, maybe I'll come up to surface. So maybe the surface tab, primitive, and then I'll grab that little cylinder component. I'll click it once and then click on the canvas to place it. So again, you can just click on the component up in the top and then click on the canvas below to place it on the canvas. You can click and drag it around and move it around if you need to. And if you want to get rid of something, just hit delete or backspace key to get rid of it. So this is a component in Grasshopper. Yours is probably going to look different to mine. By default, yours might look something like this or something like this, which is like, truly, what the hell does that even mean? So the first little tidbit in this little floating sticky note here is just a note that you might want to change your display settings so that it's drawing the full names of your components for you. So we're going to come up to the top under display. Again, on a PC, that kind of bar will just be at the top of your Grasshopper window. So we're going to come to the display dropdown. And you're going to want to check on this option here that says draw full names. We're going to want to turn that one on. Once you turn that on, you should see that the inputs and the outputs should kind of be their full extended words, not just kind of the first letter of that word. This is much, much easier to work with. It's much easier to understand what each input and output means. And it's also better just to kind of like learn, as you're learning, understand what each component is doing. The other thing we're going to want to do, you can see that the name of the component isn't showing. It's just showing me a little picture, a very fuzzy picture at that, very blurry. And that's because also under display, I've got draw icons checked. So we're going to want to uncheck draw icons. That's going to take away the little blurry picture, and instead it's going to replace it with the name of that component. Again, I highly, highly recommend unchecking draw icons and making sure that draw full names is checked on. It's really good to learn the names of components, because the other way that we can add stuff to the canvas is by double clicking. So you can double click anywhere on the canvas and then search for the component that you're looking for. So if I want to use a cylinder, I can double click and type in cylinder, and it should be the one just above my little cursor there. So I can double click, search for it, and then locate it on the canvas. Yeah, I got a question? Oh, that happens sometimes. So if you're having any trouble deleting a component, that's like a weird glitch that happens. Sometimes it happens if you have a number pad on your keyboard. So like a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 number pad off to the side. If it doesn't let you delete by pressing backspace, you might have to come up to the top under edit. So the little edit drop down and hit delete here. Or yeah, if you have a dedicated number pad, there should be a delete button on that number pad. Do you have an edit drop down?
Yeah, that works.
That works, okay. So unfortunately, I don't know, that happens to some special people every once in a while. I would recommend updating Rhino if you haven't in a while. But otherwise, unfortunately, you're kind of cursed with having to come up to edit and then delete if backspace doesn't work for you. Any other questions at this point? Okay, so we've got our little cylinder component. We can either drag it down from the tab up at the top or double click and search for it, which is why it's really good to know the name of stuff. I find 99% of the time I'll just double click and type. I find it a lot faster, and also I don't remember where stuff is or lives in these tabs, so I'm definitely a big double click and type person. So yeah, this is a basic component. I'll come over to this little blue chunk over here and we can zoom in on what's happening, what these key elements are. So you can see I've got a component here. You can see this little chunk or box is called a component. It's got inputs on the left-hand side and outputs on the right-hand side. Both of them will have these kind of like little white nubs coming out of them. These are kind of like input or output nodes there. And you can click and drag on them to start kind of pulling or connecting wires. So these little connections between components and the things you're plugging into them, those are wires. These number sliders on the left-hand side are an example of something that you can plug into a component in Grasshopper. So these are number sliders. They're a really helpful way of changing the numbers that you're using with a component. So you can click on this little diamond and drag that number around to change it. This is what's happening in Grasshopper, but there's also things happening inside of Rhino. So if I come back into my Rhino window, maybe I'll make Grasshopper window a little bit smaller. You can see what's happening is I've got this component called center box. It's drawing that geometry for me inside of Rhino at my origin point here. So Grasshopper works with nodes, but it's ultimately creating geometry and working with stuff inside of Rhino. That's why the two pair together. You can see if I click and drag these number sliders around, the geometry that I'm getting in Rhino automatically updates. So you can play around with those sliders and change the dimensions of that center box. You can see when I click on that component inside of Grasshopper, it's going to turn green. So when I have a component selected in Grasshopper, it goes green. And you can see that same geometry in Rhino also goes green. So it's really easy to tell kind of what exactly you're talking about by clicking on it in Grasshopper and seeing what turns green inside of Rhino. However, if you go to click on it in Rhino, so let's say, okay, I want to take this box and move it around. Oops, sorry. There's nothing there to select. You can see by default, it'll be kind of this like ghosty red color. And it's a little bit transparent and see-through because there's nothing actually physically there in Rhino to click on. If I go into my Rhino window and click and drag it, there's nothing there. It's not going to let me select anything. all geometry that you're making in Grasshopper is kind of like theoretical until we bake it or cook it into Rhino. So let's say I'm super happy with the dimensions of my centered box and I want to make it real inside of Rhino. I can come to my center box component, right click on it, and there's a couple different options that show up for me here. The one I'm interested in is bake. The icon is a little fried egg. I'm not sure why it's a fried egg, but maybe you're baking your eggs. So if we right click on that component and choose the fried egg or bake, it's going to prompt us which layer we want to cook it onto. Which layer in Rhino do you want to bake that geometry onto? You can choose any one you want, then hit OK. Just ignore these other settings for now. And you should be able to then select that geometry inside of Rhino and start to move it around and change it and play with it. So that's how you move from Grasshopper back into Rhino. You can see that Grasshopper geometry still exists there. The basic recipe is still up and running. We can change those parameters inside of Grasshopper and then kind of rebake a new shape to then play with in Rhino. Until you bake it, it's not real. In terms of units, so what do these numbers mean? When it says, okay, we're gonna make it 6 in the Z direction, what does that actually mean? The units that Grasshopper is using is whatever your Rhino file is set to. So right now my Rhino file is working in millimeters. That means when I'm changing these sliders, it's working in millimeter units. So when it's set to 5, that means 5 millimeters. 8, it's 8 millimeters. So that's just what this little sticky is talking about. Grasshopper works in whatever units your Rhino file is set to. If we change the units, so I can come back into Rhino and type in units. I can change it there. Maybe I want it set to meters instead. It'll give you this kind of helpful dialogue for, do you want to change the size of your objects or do you just want to change the unit system? I'll hit OK. And now you can see my units are in meters down at the bottom here. And when I'm changing these sliders, now it's talking about meters. Okay, so I'm going to scroll over to the next little box we have here, which is components. There's a couple different types of components in Grasshopper. We've already played with this kind of basic geometry component, the cylinder. There's a few other ways to start to play around with inputs, so changing what you're plugging into these kinds of components, and then transforming the outputs with things like operational components. You don't need to know these names. It's just kind of like a broad way to categorize things. So we're going to look at a panel for a second, this little panel. Panels are a super useful, really versatile tool inside of Grasshopper to write stuff down, plug in numbers into things, and start to kind of change and modify inputs. So you can get to panels by coming up to the params tab. So the very first tab up at the top, params or parameters. And then clicking on this little sticky note icon under input. So params, input, and then this little yellow panel icon. When you drop it on the canvas, it's going to look something like this. It'll say panel up at the top, and then double click to edit panel content. If you double click, you can start typing away, type whatever you want. Panels are really useful for typing in numbers. So let's come back to this cylinder component. we'll take a look at this panel, what's already plugged into it. So we've got a recipe for cooking a cylinder, and we have some numbers plugged into the base here. The base determines essentially that first click. Where do you want to place the cylinder in Rhino 3D space? So it's asking for kind of a center point, essentially. And what this panel has here, it's got essentially 2 points that it's plugging into this cylinder system here. It's got this first one up at the top, 0, 0, 0, and then a second point down below, 10, 0, 0, 0. And the way that this is set up, when we're talking about coordinates inside of Grasshopper, this first number here is talking about an X number, so an X coordinate. The second number is going to be your Y coordinate. And the third number is going to be our Z coordinate. So if these numbers are set to 0, 0, 0, the center point is going to be right at the center of our origin inside of Rhino. So if I take a look inside of Grasshopper, you can see it's starting to draw a little cylinder at the center point of my Rhino file. But this big kind of ghosty box that we made is getting in the way. So if we want to turn something off in Grasshopper so that we don't see it in Rhino anymore, we want to preview off that component. So turn the preview off. I'll come back to my center box component that's drawing this big ghosty box over everything. Right click on it. So I'm going to right click on center box and uncheck where it says preview. There's like a little icon of a head for some reason. So we're going to turn off the preview by unchecking that. You can see my ghosty box goes away and my component turns this like slightly darker gray color. If you want to turn it back on, you can do the opposite. So right click and check on where it says preview. You can see that component turns a slightly lighter tone of gray. That means it's previewed on. And then right click, uncheck preview to turn it off. It still exists in Grasshopper, so it's still doing the work to kind of create that Grasshopper geometry, but we're just not seeing it inside of Rhino. It's still working, we're just not looking at it in Rhino. So I can come back to my cylinder component here. This one's that slightly darker gray. So it's actually not turned on yet. There's a little cylinder that's being drawn at our origin, but that's actually coming from a component somewhere else. So we've got a lighter gray cylinder down here under component colors. So if you're lost, it's just this little, if this is where we started, we're going down to this chunk down at the bottom here, this little gray box. So we'll zoom in on component colors. You can see that this component is turned on, it's previewed on because it's this nice light gray color. That means you've got a happy component. When it's a nice light gray, everything's running okay, it's not missing anything, it's good to go. If we right click on it and turn off, it'll turn this slightly darker gray color. It's still happy, it's running okay, but it's not being shown in Rhino. If you want to fully turn something off, so you're like, okay, please stop running. Maybe it's really computationally heavy or you made a mistake and you don't actually want to be using that component. We can right click on it, and this time you can check the little light switch button here that says enabled. So again, right click on the component and choose the light switch that says enabled. That's going to disable your component. the whole thing will be kind of grayed out. It's not going to run. It's disabled. Again, same thing if you want to undo that, so we can right click and enable it once more by just clicking the little light switch button. We'll come back to these two colors, orange and red, but those are kind of warning signs that something's wrong. We'll come back to that in a second. I'm going to pop back up to where we say components up at the top here. We had our little panel plugging in some kind of basic information into cylinder. This one's a dark gray color, so we're not going to see anything in Rhino. If we want to turn it on, we have to right click on it and preview on. And you can see now it's drawing two cylinders here. So it's got the one at the origin, that's kind of that default cylinder. And it's also got this kind of ghostly twin over here. That's coming from this second input where we said 10, 0, 0. So we've got our first one that's drawn at the origin, just right at 0, 0, 0. And then we've got this second cylinder that's being drawn at 10, 0, 0. You'll remember that 10 in this first position is talking about the X location. So it's moved 10 units to the right on the X axis. We can change this and play around with this. So I can double click on my panel and type in, maybe instead of 10, I can change this number to 5. And now you can see that cylinder is drawn a little closer. Maybe I want to move it vertically. So I can double click and change, these zeros instead. Maybe I'll make them 5 as well. So 0, 0, 5, 5, 0, 5. And now those two cylinders are being drawn 10 units up in the Z direction because we changed the number in this Z column here. If you're ever grabbing a new panel, so let's say I've got a new panel that I've grabbed from params up at the top. So params, input, little sticky note icon. And maybe I've got, maybe I want to kind of copy that input here. So we'll have one that's at 0, 0, 0. And then I'll have another that's at 0, 0, 10. If I try to plug that into base on cylinder, I can replace that existing connection just by plugging in over top of it. So I'll grab the little white nub on the right-hand side and plug that into base on cylinder. You can see that component turns red. So red means that something's wrong. Pretty intuitive. And if you hover over the little chat bubble that pops up, that gives you kind of some indication of what's going wrong. Usually it's pretty cryptic language. It's usually not super clear. In this case, it says data conversion failed from text to plain. What this is telling me is that Grasshopper thinks that what we've plugged in from this component is words. It thinks we're writing a really weird binary haiku or something. It doesn't know that we're talking about numbers. The way that we can tell it, okay, we actually want to talk about numbers here, is to right click on that panel and uncheck this little option that says multi-line data. This seems niche, but it's actually super helpful. You can see the difference between the component that we just made versus the one that was there before. They look pretty different. The one that was there before had these kind of like light and dark bands. We can ignore the color. That's just like a graphic choice. But it's got these light and dark bands. It's also got these numbers, 0, 1 on the left-hand side. And then this like darker band up at the top. And we can get that by right-clicking and unchecking multi-line data. So right click, uncheck multi-line data, and you should end up with that same kind of format. Now Grasshopper knows you're talking about a number, and your cylinder component should run just fine. Yeah, we got a question?
Might be a silly question, but how do you like get a wire to be no longer connecting from the component to from like a panel to the geometry component?
Oh, great question. So there's a little note over here that can tell you how to do just that. So let's say you've got a wire connected and you want to disconnect it. If you hold down Control on a PC or Command on a Mac, you can see that your cursor turns into this like weird little, there's like a little, the arrow turns red and you'll get a little minus button. So if you hold down Control or Command and click on what it's plugged into, you can drag it back to where it came from and it'll disconnect. So again, just hold down Command or Control, click and drag it back to where it came from, and it'll disconnect. Another way you can do the exact same thing, just a slightly different route, is to right click on whatever it's plugged into. So let's say it's plugged into this geometry component here. I can right click on it, and there's an option here that says disconnect. So right click, disconnect, and then cylinder. And that will do the exact same thing. Great question. Any other questions at this point so far? Kind of boring so far, but it'll get more interesting. Yeah, I got a question. Sorry, I'm super hard of hearing. I didn't catch that. Oh, yeah, getting rid of the big shaded box in Rhino. That came earlier on. So our initial explorations, we were playing around with this center box component. And that one by default is going to be turned on, previewed on. It'll look something like this. If you want to turn it off, you don't want to see it in Rhino anymore, you can right click on that component and uncheck where it says preview. So we're going to preview off that component. It should disappear inside of Rhino. Yeah, no problem. Yeah, another question? Yeah, good question. That could be because what you're plugging into the component is kind of like not what it's expecting. So let's say you've done all the right things. You've right-clicked. You've checked multi-line data or unchecked multi-line data here. So it knows that you're talking about a number. You're not writing it a poem. It's still really picky in terms of formatting. So in this case, if we make any errors like I'll double click and I'll type in, maybe I'll add a couple spaces or something in the mix or a letter. That'll turn my component red too because it's not exactly what it's expecting, which is kind of a 3-point kind of coordinate system. So we've got to be super, super specific when we're typing into this input here. It's got to be a number, so maybe I'll check 1, 3, 5, and nothing else. If we hit enter even, so if you hit enter and there's kind of a new line created, that might do the same thing because now we've got a little entry below that says empty. So that little empty space will also kind of freak out your component as well. You might get big, scary red component too. In which case, we just have to make sure that we didn't kind of hit enter after the fact. So we'll double click and just make sure to delete or kind of hit backspace so that there's no enter after that point. That should fix the issue. Did that help?
Yeah.
Sweet. Any other questions? Yeah.
Are connectors a little bit different than yours? Like those little gray connector things? I have two. Does that mean anything?
So if you have two coming out of your panel, it just means that it's probably like plugged into something else, if that's the case. Otherwise, it might be kind of that initial component. So the one that was plugged in the first time might still be plugged into that first component. That would be my guess. Otherwise, if your wires look a little bit different, that's okay. We can kind of ignore that for now. We'll pay attention to the way that the wires look a little further on when we get into like managing numbers and data and stuff. If you ever want to plug multiple things into the same input, you can see by default, if I try to plug both of these panels into base on cylinder, it just kind of removes whatever was there before. So plugging something new in will just kind of like yeet out whatever was plugged in before. If you want to plug in two things at once, you can definitely do that. You just have to make sure you hold down Shift while you do it. Once you press Shift, you can see your little arrow is going to turn green. There will be a little tiny baby plus sign. And now both panels are connected into this cylinder component. Again, if you want to get rid of one or the other, right click, come up to disconnect. And then if you kind of hover over your options, the one that you're selecting, that wire is going to turn kind of dark red. So that'll let you know exactly which one you're disconnecting if you've got multiple things plugged in. Whoopsie. I think my computer is like on its last legs. It's low battery. It's upset. We're getting there in terms of just kind of the basics that we want to cover today. So this little chunk below is also just talking about panels. So panels are one way we can plug in number into components, but there's also another way of plugging in numbers into components like this one here, which is sphere. So I'm just in the little chunk below our components chunk. So I'm in this little section now that's talking about panels. We kind of already ran through panels, so I won't linger on them anymore. But another way that we can add numbers into a component like this one, sphere, is by using the number slider, which we had plugged into our cylinder component earlier on. The number slider is up under parameters, so params, input, and then number slider. So you can click and place that one on the canvas as well. By default, it's going to have a pretty limited range. It's going to be between 0 and 1. And you can see when you slide that slider, the bottom value is going to be 0 and the max value you can have is 1. That's just because it doesn't know what numbers you care about when you click it from the kind of panel up at the top here. So params, input, number slider, it's always going to give you between 0 and 1. Which is fine if you're working at that scale. I can take this number slider and plug it into my sphere component that I have going on here. So sphere. So I'll plug my number slider into radius on sphere. We're not going to see anything in Rhino until we turn it on. So I'm going to right click and check yes on preview. So turn on the preview. And now you should see a tiny little baby sphere being drawn at the origin. And when I change around that number slider that I've plugged in, the radius should automatically update. But maybe I want that sphere to be bigger than 1 unit or 1 meter across. If you want to change the maximum of what you can slide a number slider around to, we can just double click on our number slider, kind of over the text where it says number slider. and it'll open up this window that's just kind of like the settings for your number slider. We can pretty much ignore everything for now, but we just want to change this max value. So under numeric domain, max, you can see right now it's set at 1, so it's capped that number slider at 1. But if we double click, I can type in a number here like 100. Hit the little check mark, make sure you hit the check mark and set OK. And now my number slider goes from 0 all the way up to 100. So we can slide around a much bigger sphere. Another shortcut to grab a number slider, instead of kind of clicking and dragging it from up at the top here, another way to grab a number slider is to double click on the canvas. It'll start searching, and then you can just type in whatever number you're interested in. So maybe I want my number slider to start at, or to have the value set at 65. You can see the second I start typing in a number, it's going to prompt you for a number slider. So no matter what number you type in, it's going to generate a number slider for you. So again, that was just by double clicking on the canvas and typing in a number. So maybe I'll do 700 and hit enter. And now I've got a number slider that kind of encompasses that number. So I've got a slider that goes from 0 to 1,000. I didn't have to change the maximum settings on it because that number to start with was pretty large. I can type in the number 10,000, for example, and now I'll have a number slider that goes from 0 to 10,000. It kind of works in like units of 10. So if I have like 999 as the number that I type in, oopsie, it should give me a number slider from 0 to 1,000. That's kind of the fastest way to work with number sliders. These are something you'll use really frequently with components inside of Grasshopper. My computer is truly on its last legs here. You can also just see that some components are good for calculating things as well. So we've got our sphere. There's another component attached to it on the right-hand side. Everything in Grasshopper runs from left to right. So it's kind of like reading a book in English anyway. Everything that exists on the left can then be fed forward into something on the right. We can't really go and plug something kind of in the future or down the line. We can't really take that and plug it into an earlier component. It doesn't really work like that. Things always flow from left to right. So we've got this sphere that's being generated from our number slider or our panel or whatever. And there's another component here that it's being fed into that's calculating its volume. This one's got an old sticker slapped on top, which is rude, but it just means that it's like an older version of that component. There's a newer one inside of Grasshopper that might do things slightly differently. But it's still working, still does the same thing. You can see what's coming out of that component on the right-hand side is a big old number. That's calculating the volume of that sphere in real time. So if we make any changes to the radius of the sphere on the left-hand side, so I'll scroll a little ways back. Maybe I'll make the radius a little bit smaller. You can see that the volume that it's calculating on the right-hand side is automatically updating. This is another use for panels. So panels, it's the exact same thing. It's that same sticky note. A great tool for understanding kind of what's coming out of a component or what's being calculated. So we can plug that volume in to panel and see exactly what the volume of that sphere is in real time. I'll navigate over to the top right-hand corner here. This is basically just kind of reiterating what I just said just now. Scripts always flow from left to right. So everything you change on the left-hand side, for example, the radius and length of the cylinder, will kind of percolate through your definition and affect everything to the right. This is an example of a really basic little recipe or definition that we've cooked up that makes a cylinder. So if I preview it on, it's making this kind of chunky cylinder at the center here. Then we've taken that geometry and we've fed it into another component down the line. This one is a move component, so it's taking that geometry and it's moving it. And if I right click and preview this component on, you can see that moved copy slightly elevated on top of the original cylinder. So they're two kind of ghosts like over top of each other a little bit. Both of them still exist. I can go back to my original cylinder and bake it. Or I can grab this new slightly moved one. It's moved up a little bit, so it's moved up by 10 units. And I can cook that one in Rhino if I want to. I can also change this motion input if I like. By default, it's set to 0, 0, 10, which you can tell by hovering over that little input. You can see by default, there's kind of a default value cooked in there. That's something else we could change with a panel or a number slider if we wanted. I think we kind of got the gist for now. Other things to keep in mind that are super helpful when you're working or getting started in Grasshopper is that things can get really kind of messy spaghetti styles really quickly. So it's a good idea to use groups wherever possible. When you've kind of made a little chunk that does something or a little kind of baby operation here, you can group things by selecting multiple objects. So hold Shift and select multiple things, and then hit Control or Command G to group. And it'll make a nice kind of little like ghosty group around your objects. This is kind of nice because you can kind of name those groups as well, which is helpful if you're going back to edit or reuse a script that you've cooked or baked before. If you want to give a group a name, you can right click on it. And there should be a little text, little text field up at the top of your right click window here where you can give it a name. So group 1, just in the little text input by right clicking on that group. And that helps keep things really organized and clear. So we'll wrap up just by doing an example of kind of how something a little bit more like parametric styles inside of Grasshopper. I'm going to take everything in this definition and actually maybe I'll open a new file. So my Grasshopper file is separate from my Rhino file. The two are not linked. So any work that I've done inside of Grasshopper, if I want to save it, you have to hit save while you're inside of the Grasshopper environment. So you can hit Control or Command S, or come up to File and then Save Document. I'm going to hit Save As, and I'll show you what it saves out is exactly what we opened before, and that's going to be a Grasshopper binary file. So that's a .gh file. This is something totally separate from Rhino. So you can save your Grasshopper file out. And if I close it, the only things that still exist in Rhino are the ones that I hit bake on, that I baked into Rhino space. If I want to save these, you'll have to save your Rhino file as well. But I'll reopen Grasshopper. If you ever hit the big X on Grasshopper, You can reopen it by hitting the little Grasshopper button or typing Grasshopper into the command line. It'll still kind of keep your definition there. It won't fully close it until you close Rhino. I'm going to open a new Grasshopper document. So we can come up to File, New Document, or hit Control or Command N. So we've got a nice blank canvas to work with. And this time, instead of making one cylinder, I'm going to cook a whole bunch of cylinders. So we can grab our cylinder component one more time. I'll come up to Surface and grab my little baby cylinder. You can also double click and type in cylinder. You can see there's 3 inputs on the left-hand side of cylinder: base, radius, and length. So radius and length are pretty self-explanatory. Radius is like, how wide do you want that puppy to be? Length is going to be, in this case, a little counterintuitive. Length is just going to be how tall that cylinder is. Base is kind of the interesting one. So base is like, where do you want to place the cylinder? And in this case, to be a little bit more parametric, I'm going to generate a bunch of kind of starting points for that cylinder. So I'm going to make a grid of cylinders and plug a grid into this base component here to generate a whole bunch of cylinders at different points. So first things first, I'm going to generate a grid of points inside of Grasshopper. And I can do that by coming up to the Vector tab. So Vector, and then this little grid bucket. This is where you can make all kinds of grids in Grasshopper. I'm going to choose a square grid for now. So Vector, grid, and then square. I'll click to place it on the canvas here. You can see it's a light gray color, so it's already running without changing any inputs. And if I zoom in a little bit on my canvas, or sorry, on my Rhino space here, when I click on that square component, you can see the grid that it's generating kind of at my Rhino origin point. So that's the grid that Grasshopper's generating. There's a couple different inputs we can play around with, but I'm going to ignore those for now. Let's just say that I'm happy with the defaults that it's set to. You can hover over the inputs to see what those defaults are. So if I hover over size, you can see that the default grid cell size is 1 unit. So in this case, it's 1 unit by 1 unit. Extent X is how many grid cells do you want in the X direction. And then extent Y is how many do you want in the Y direction. Both are set to 5. So you can see I've got a little 5 by 5 grid popping up here. I can take the output of square grid, so this points output on the right-hand side. If you hover over it, you can see it's a list of 36 points. That's just grabbing the corner points of all of those little kind of cells in our grid. I can plug points into base on cylinder. And now you can see I've got a whole gamut of cylinders being generated at those different points. So points gets plugged into base. And now I've got a whole grid of cylinders being drawn. We can play around with the radius and the height of these cylinders by using a nice number slider. So I can double click and grab a number slider for the radius maybe. So I'll double click and I'll type in maybe 2 to start, 2 meters. And hit enter. That's going to give me a number slider set to the value 2. I can plug that into radius on cylinder. And now suddenly my cylinders are really super wide. I can shrink that a little bit if I want, or make it even bigger. But this is how suddenly you can be working with a ton of geometry really quickly. Maybe I need a value less than 1 to start with. So maybe this number slider isn't going to cut it. I can double click and type in 0.5 instead. 0.5. I'll hit enter. And I'm going to use this number slider instead. So I'm going to kind of boot out the one that's already plugged into radius with a new one. This smaller number slider is going to let me work with tighter values, and I can get more kind of constrained radii here. You can see that this one value is controlling all of my cylinders that are being produced. So I can change the height of all of them at the same time, or sorry, the radius. Next class, we're going to go into a little bit more detail about how we can generate different heights. So if we've got a grid of cylinders like this, how can we generate a whole kind of range of heights depending on different variables? That's starting to get into playing with data. So as a little precursor, you can see that the line from points to base is this kind of weird dashed texture. So instead of a normal wire, it's got this weird dashed form. That's an indicator that the data is structured in a specific way. So if we grab another panel or a little sticky note, so again, those sticky notes are just under params, input, and then panel. Oopsie. We can plug that points data into our panel here. So points goes into this panel. And you can see we've got a big list of points. But if we scroll down on this big list, you can see it's broken into chunks. It's broken into chunks of 6 points each. We won't get into that today, but that's kind of where we're heading next class, is starting to understand what those different chunks are doing so that we can get a little bit more control over the data and start to control the maybe varying heights of different cylinders in this grid. So I'll wrap it up there. I'll stick around if anybody has any Grasshopper questions, but otherwise there's no checkpoint for today. We'll push the checkpoints to Fridays, and I'll see you on Friday for an expansion into data management. Have a good week. Good luck with Studio.